Ladies and gentlemen, my next guest is Isabel. She is a Akashic Records specialist. She's able to channel those things. She's also a Reiki master.
Yeah,
Can you say Reiki
Reiki
master?
master, correct.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of levels.
Okay.
So more masters are able to attune others to the Reiki energy so that they can then start servicing. If you're at a lower level, you can only do it on yourself. That's first level. So
Hmm.
you're only able to channel the energy for yourself. Second level is you're able to channel for yourself and others. And for third, you're able to then transmit that energy so that others can do the same. So
And,
that's the distinction.
and you're on the third level.
Yeah, correct.
Watch out, next level. Right on. So I found her, and she's like super sweet. She's able to jump on my podcast, and she's just been teaching me a lot about the Akashic Records and where it just originated from. I mean, do we really know where it originated from?
I don't think so. I think there's not, I mean, there's a lot of people out there that have become probably a little bit more popular around it than others.
Like Edgar
And
Casey?
so, yeah, and I've kind of followed more of like Linda Howe's progress in how she came about the records, and everybody has their own way. But I think that's the same thing with everybody, like even
Okay.
Reiki has different kind of disciplines. The most familiar one that people are used to is probably the traditional like Usui
Like
version,
Japanese
the
Reiki?
Japanese
Okay.
Reiki, but there's also Egyptian versions of
Is
it.
there?
Yeah, it's called Sekhem, which is from a different, it's one of the Egyptian goddesses, Sekhmet. Uh, Same kind of ideas, so you can kind of trace it on there
Okay.
as well. There's a lot of commonalities, and those are just the ones that we know of, right? So I'm sure that there's different ways of doing the
Yeah.
same
I'm sure there's like
thing.
a Middle Eastern version.
Right, and
There's
it's
like
not
a.
all named Reiki,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
anything that's basically channeling energy with your hands. You can find references of that almost in any kind of religious
Yeah, you
context.
can. Surprisingly, there's a lot of that in religion.
Yeah, and
There
it's the
is.
same thing. It's just we're labeling it something
Have
else.
you heard of the Book of Enoch?
Yes, I've heard of the Book of
Yeah.
Enoch.
So that guy apparently was able to vibrate so high that
Mm-hmm.
he's able to lift his whole city and all the people in there,
Mm-hmm.
and poof,
Yeah,
gone.
yeah.
And they
It's
said that out of the Bible.
it's all about
Yeah.
vibrations and
Yeah.
energies and.
As far as the Book of Akashic Records,
Mhm.
can you tell us a little more about that, like from scratch? Because most people don't really
Sure.
know what that is.
Sure. Yeah, and I totally get that. It's a thing that's kind of getting a little bit more popular these days because
Mhm.
I've seen it myself. So the Akashic Records is really, I mean, the simplest way of kind of describing is it's almost like a library. What it actually is, it's an energy field that exists, not necessarily on our plane, but it's an energy field that just exists at a slightly higher elevation than what we are normally able to like connect with.
Like the quantum field in a
Like
sense.
a quantum field in a
Ooh.
sense, but it's always there, right? And so it basically records every impression of every iteration of our souls through history. So the same way that we would, now with technology record ourselves on film, that film stays
That's
in
permanently there. And you can
existence
put it in the cloud now.
and put it in the cloud. So same thing, but imagine at a soul level, and every thought that you've ever had, again through many lifetimes, and everything that ever will be is kind of captured into this hall of records. Some people that are more visually inclined, not myself, do see it more of a library. And so basically, when I'm working with someone doing the Akashic Records, the entry point for almost all practitioners is what we call a pathway. Some people can kind of change the name of that however they want to, but it's a special sequencing of words, and words carry vibrations,
Yes, they
right?
can like
So, like Om and all those things. So when you link words together, they tend to kind of create a path so that then you can then access the records.
Okay.
So that's the entry point. That's the most common way. I'm sure there's other ways that I'm not familiar with that people can access the information. But usually, what that does is then it raises my vibration and the client's vibration so that we're able then to sit in that space where the veil is very thin, and so able to then receive information that we would otherwise not be able to receive. And so, different than a medium where they're used to speaking to their own guides or they're assigned one person that they get information through, this is more of a direct communication with your
Higher being.
higher being or group of beings. So it's really more of a collective, right?
Okay.
It's not just usually one thing or one communication. when I'm in the records, I usually refer to as they are saying, because it's very much a group conversation. So technically, we deal with energies of in a sense of a hierarchy. So if you think about it as like the closest way I can describe it is like a school. You have what we call our masters, our teachers, and loved ones is the hierarchy. And so masters are like your principal. So they're in charge to make sure that your soul kind of evolves through the grades the way that it's supposed to and
Mm-hmm.
continues to graduate. Teachers are the ones that are assigned to you in that particular lifetime that then hands out the lessons that to make sure that you're, you know, performing and doing everything at the level that you're supposed to. And then your loved ones would be like your peers. So the people who have experienced life before perhaps have had a connection to you, usually have had a connection to you, but maybe not in this lifetime, perhaps in another.
And
So they're vibrations that have in some point taken shape in human form.
they'll imprint something on you
And they all imprint for you and they all
constantly.
work constantly and they're always trying to give you communications. It's just usually we're not
We're not.
susceptible
Yeah.
to hearing it.
How do you become? That's something that I'm kind of wrestling with.
Hmm.
Like I want to be more open to the universe.
I mean, meditation is a great way to
Yeah, I
start.
meditate all the time.
And I will say that meditation looks very differently for everyone. So I'm not a big fan of encouraging people that can't sit still. That's not the best way for everyone.
So
So
yeah.
walking is great, hiking is great, driving can be a way that people get in meditation. I know it happens to me a lot of the time, especially if I have a long drive.
Mm-hmm.
I might get lost in my thoughts, and before I know it, I've arrived where I was supposed to go. Not like I check in, but your mind does its own thing and your body kind of operates on autopilot, right? So I think meditation just takes a different shape, and I hesitate when I get people, they're like, I'm trying really good to meditate. I'm like, well, what is that for you? And they're like, I'm
Yeah.
sitting down, but I can't sit still. I'm like, well, then that doesn't work for you. Like,
I got that to work for me because I was diagnosed with like ADHD, hyperactive.
right.
But now I can meditate for like 4 hours a day. But here's the thing: it took a lot of effort,
Yeah, sure.
and I tried to start for like 5 minutes a day.
And everything does. I mean, when you're dealing with things of metaphysical, I think it's just like anything else in life, right? You don't just suddenly wake up one day, at least the majority of people don't wake up
Yeah,
one day with something they didn't know that they could do, right?
one hundred
There's
percent. Unless you
oh,
have like a near-death experience,
exactly. There are those very rare
but that's very
occasions,
extreme, and
but
you don't want to have a near-death
and you
experience.
don't. And it's very shocking for the people who do, and it takes a lot on them as well to process because they're no longer the person they were before. So
Yeah.
there's a more gradual way of doing that, and just like anything else in life, it requires work, it requires discipline, it requires practice, and the more that you build and tap into it, intention has a lot to do with it as well. So if your intention is that you want to connect and you want to make yourself much more open to receiving messages, then say that. I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of the time, it's funny because I work with clients sometimes and they're like, I'm trying to manifest all these things. I'm like, well, how are you going about it? And they're like, oh, there's all these conditions and rules. And then I kind of boil it down and I find out at the end of the day that they're not even really asking, they're implying.
So
And
just ask.
just ask, like, if I do this or if I do that, will I get this or I want this? Or it's not very clear and it's very like, that's not how it works. Like, we just, if you want something, ask for that something and then surrender and don't worry about how it happens.
Just send the intention out to
Just
the
set the
universe.
intention that you'll get that and it'll take shape and unfold however that is. But there's a bit of surrender in that as well,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's like we as humans like to say, well, if we do this, this, then this. They don't care about those things, right? It's more of like the end goal. And so it may not always look the way that you want it to.
So it's not cause and effect. It's more like you're causing effect.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much, it's like say what you want and then let go of the how.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the how. Just trust that the how will be resolved for you in the way that it needs to unfold for you.
I feel like a lot of people are having a hard time with that because we've been taught if you work really hard in life
Mm.
and you slave away for 20 years, then you might have the big house, then you
Yeah.
might have that.
And
Versus,
sometimes you don't.
yeah, well, a lot of times you probably don't
You don't.
because, yeah, it's someone that just is simplifying things
Yeah. And
and
then
just
you live with the
surrenders.
trauma of all the societal pressures that have been placed on you that weren't yours to begin with, because chances are you didn't probably think that at one point. That was something that you learned
Yeah.
and then you took it on as your own, but it was never yours to begin with, right?
Yep. Yep.
You chose that without realizing you chose it.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes it's not more like what you need to learn; it's what you need to unlearn.
Exactly. A lot of the time is like, well, is this, I think you should approach things more of like, is this serving you?
It's a
If it
serving you.
doesn't serve you, then why does it exist for you?
Why are
Like,
you
what are
even
you
putting up
holding
with it?
on to
Yeah.
it? Exactly. Like, tolerance is great, but not really. Like, tolerance is a form of coping. We tolerate things because we feel we have to. Well, why do we have to? That's where you have to
Social
start breaking
pressure,
things
this, that. You
down and
tolerate
seeing,
certain family members
yeah,
during the holidays.
do I have to?
No, I really don't. I really don't.
Right?
Right.
Or
Yeah.
or at least it becomes a choice and say I'm going to tolerate it, right? But it becomes more of a conscious choice rather than you doing it for the sake of doing it because you're kind of on autopilot, right? You're
Right.
responding in the same way you've always responded, but without that choice.
W-
And I think that's the distinction. You start to live a much more freeing life when you realize that life is a series of choices
It is.
and you keep making choices.
One thing that I'm actually having a hard time with, and a lot of people, like what I told you, you work really hard, you do all these
Mm-hmm.
things, versus you say, I'm just trying to surrender myself to the universe, and the
Mm-hmm.
universe is just trying to give me exactly what I need
Sure.
to have. That surrender part.
It's a scary process.
It is scary because
It's a
most people haven't
scary
been
process.
taught that.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it referred to as many times like walking a tightrope, and just imagine you have the net underneath, and I'm like, I am can be very controlling. I'm, a Scorpio. People tend to say I like to have things my way. If you fall into the boxes of that, I don't necessarily conform to that either. But I have recognized that control in parts of my life has been something that I've struggled with, and really trusting things outside of myself. And from my personal experience, I know how difficult and challenging that can be. Um, but I also know the difference of what it feels like to try to control things you really can't control, and then kind of stepping away from it. And there's a different quality
Someone
to
said,
life.
jump, and the net will appear.
Exactly.
That's a little
Exactly.
hard to think that way
It's
because
hard.
it's just very materialistic, and like we've all grown up not to think that way,
Sure.
especially in the Western world. In
Sure.
the Eastern world, it's completely different.
Yeah.
Um, but I've seen it happen so many times.
Yeah.
I remember I told you I saw people just overcome stage 4 cancer
Sure.
when scientists all over the world, rich people, that went to these seminars, and they're like, dude, I have no more hope.
Mm-hmm.
The science community has given up on me. It's like, this is my last try, and
Sure.
I kept in contact with these people. Within
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks, they overcame cancer.
Yeah.
And I saw it with my own eyes. It's not like something they're making up.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, and I like to work in like baby steps when I work with my clients. A lot, it's like, and I apply. Fear is a big thing. You can't
Yeah,
just tackle it all at once, right? So it's like small. Start with small things. Like if you look at your life and think of all the things that you have to do,
you don't have
and
to
you
do
just
anything.
don't do them, what's the worst that can happen?
Nothing. I just end up on the street.
And then the more, as long as you're not being irresponsible, right? There's a certain level of like being responsible, but there are certain things that you tell yourself you have to do, but you don't really have to do.
But now I'm able to check myself.
Right. But it starts building small,
Yeah.
right? So that when you start to realize that the worst thing that you think can happen doesn't happen, you start to relate to fear a little differently, right? Because it's like, oh my God, I was doing this thing because I was afraid that the worst thing that could happen would happen, and then it doesn't. And you're like, well, what else? You know what I mean? It starts to spill over into other parts of your
hmm
life because you start to build a different conditioning, right? It's like you start to realize that thing enslaved me.
But the sad part is, it was just your own thought process that enslaved you.
Correct.
There's nothing else. There's no invincible hand doing it to you.
Nothing.
It was just
Nothing.
you, maybe all the preconceived notions you've had up to this point.
Right.
When you're like, once you shed that,
Right.
then you just what's the word you use? Or you become more liberated.
Yeah, it is a sense of freedom. It's a sense of liberation because again, you're choosing much more actively, and you're more aware of the fact that you're choosing and not just having things happen to you in life, right? Like there are certainly things that are outside of your control, but there's also things that are within your control, and it's finding balance. And then you're always able to kind of be mindful with work, and sometimes it takes more work than others of taking an active role and being more deliberate in your life rather than responsive.
Yeah, definitely. Can you tell me a little more? You really caught my attention when you said being more creative is important,
Yeah.
and how you work with creative people, and it makes more sense because you're also an artist.
Yeah, so I'm a designer. I've been in the fashion world for many years. So I have that practical business sense. So I'm very much grounded in that. But I think one of the things that I try to communicate is I do tend to attract more creative
Good,
clients, right?
good.
And
They're more fun.
so they're more fun. I think that they can also try to relate a little bit. And so what I try to explain is that a lot of like creative people actually are pretty intuitive. They don't see it that way though. So I mean, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's writing, it's whatever form, right? It's very different than applied sciences
Yeah,
or anything
that's
else,
not
right?
ABC
It's not
mathematics.
AZC math. You know, a writer doesn't sit down and necessarily follow like a guideline. They may, right? But as at a certain point, things get a life of their own, right? So you start working on something and you get an idea, and then that idea becomes another idea. Well, where is all that information coming
It's been
from?
downloaded.
Right? You somehow know, and you know when it's right and you know when it's wrong, but there's no right way. Like, you can't scientifically say that's why I chose this. You can't really ask a creative person to explain their creative process. It's just their process, right? And so that same process is the same process that people who are intuitive kind of go through. They can't really explain it, but the sensation and the feeling is the same, right? You just know when something's right and you know when something's wrong, and you know when you're done with a piece of work and when it needs more work. There's a distinct quality that I think only creative people can really kind of like attest to, right? It's
Right.
like you keep playing. If you're a musician, you keep playing, and then eventually you just know that it's right.
How do you trust that more though? You said meditation.
Yeah, and I think just building on that practice, I feel like like any feeling that becomes addictive, right? You
Mm-hmm.
always like to feel good, and
Yeah.
there's a sense of when you're doing that work that it feels really good, like oh my god, I got it, right?
Yeah.
And so like imagine if you can just practice that more so that you become addicted to that feeling of like oh my god, this feels so good because I feel like I've got it, right? And the more you get those wins, I think the more you put yourself out there, and then you get more wins, and then you start to rake in all of those benefits,
Ladies
and
and
you
gentlemen,
start to
listen to this lady. She knows what she's doing. No, it's totally cool that we're just like on the same page. And
yeah,
I messaged her like 3 days ago.
yeah,
I found her on Yellow Pages,
of all
Yelp.
places.
Yeah, and but that's how I usually do it.
Yeah, great.
And I just find people, and you know what? I just send an intention like, hey, you know what? It's totally gonna work out. We're
Mhm.
gonna have an amazing time. I'm gonna just more importantly, I'm gonna learn, and I'm
Yeah,
just gonna share this knowledge with other people.
happy to share
And
it
yeah, they could always come back to you. You know, in my hometown, Pasadena, California.
for sure.
Yeah. I told my friends about it.
Mm.
Like, you just meet this lady, just gonna go to her house and just do a podcast. Like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, bro, there's nothing wrong with me. Like people, most people are genuinely just nice and kind,
Yeah,
and you can actually do it. Thank you for welcoming me here.
you're welcome.
Back to the Akashic Records.
Yeah.
I just want to know a little bit more about it. How do you think Edgar Casey, the
Mhm.
very famous guy
Mhm.
from the Midwest,
Mhm.
back in the 50s and 40s when no one
Mhm.
even knew anything about this,
Mhm.
he was able to access those things?
I mean, I think some people are inherently connected to that information. Some people just operate at different frequencies. Um, so I think some people are just more in tune to that organically, and then some other people need tools. For me, I need the pathway to kind of connect, you know? So um, and I prefer it that way, honestly, because I live a life that's very similar to anybody else, and so I would prefer to control that a little bit more. There's that controlling
Yeah,
aspect that
yeah,
we were talking about
yeah.
earlier. Like, I don't want to constantly be bombarded with information that I don't necessarily want. You know, I
But you,
interact with friends and families. I don't want to
yeah, I get it, I get it. You could go in and go out.
go in and go out.
Right.
Exactly.
You're
So
not like,
I would
I get
prefer
it.
to set up an intention and say, okay, I'm connecting now and I'm disconnecting now, and we're
Yeah,
closing, and then I go about my business and you go about yours, and we're all happy, you know, rather than just kind of free flow information. And it would be a little too much of the Wild West in my
yeah.
in my
I mean,
life for that.
yeah. I completely understand. And one thing Edgar Casey did say is like there's nothing special about me.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has this information in
Agree.
them, and they could access it anytime.
Sure.
Would you agree?
I would agree. I mean, there's honestly, if the Akashic Records is something that somebody is interested in, there's a bunch of books
Like I'm interested in it.
that you could pick up, and if you read their pathway, and the more you connect, you get it.
Would
I
you point
mean,
us in the right direction?
sure. Like I said, Linda Howe is one of the first ones that I read, and she has her pathway in there. And she explains, the structure of it, and really all the guidance that she provides is the more you communicate, the more you receive, right? So it's like learning a new language. You start little bits,
Mm-hmm.
and then the more you get comfortable, the more fluent you get. And so there's also a level of excitement in their world when it's like you want to communicate. It's like, oh my God, they want to communicate.
Yeah,
And so, or they're open and willing, right? Because a lot of it is our own will and our
it
own
is.
desire. And so it's not for everyone. It's
Yeah,
not something that everybody's interested. They're not just gonna.
I'm personally not too interested in communicating with other entities, but I have.
Mhm.
I've like meditated, and sometimes my whole body was just shaking, and there was like nothing special about that
No.
meditation. It's like I have a morning meditation and
Mhm.
then one before I go to sleep, and like I was gone.
Yep.
Like there was visual, auditory,
Yeah.
like I was feeling certain things. My whole body was shaking for over an hour,
Yeah.
and I mean I wasn't delusional because I don't do anything, but there was like entities there,
Sure.
like literally there, and they were shocked that I was there,
Sure.
and they're like, "What's going on?" And I'm like, "I don't ask me."
Yeah.
And I was like, I was somewhere else. I knew my body was there,
Mhm.
but I was that my consciousness was somewhere else.
Sure.
That only happened once or twice in my life, but it has happened, and like all I need is just that one experience.
Yeah. So I mean, there's energies constantly around us all the
Yeah,
time. We only have our human senses are only capable of reaching so far, right?
yeah,
In all of our senses, right? Sight, sound, taste, etc. Some people have that more developed than others. A lot of that is for our own protection, you
yeah,
know. But if you're willing to expand yourself and your range, you can absolutely do that. Again, it just takes more practice and discipline and listening to the silence a lot of the time because
yeah.
that's where it is, right? It's there, it's happening. I think before this we were kind of talking lightly, and it's like I describe it to a lot of my clients as imagine it's like a radio station that's constantly playing in the background. It's just you can't always tune into it, but it's always there. And sometimes you can, like, I can tune that up when I want to and then tune it back down when I don't want to, right?
Yeah,
But it doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just
it's always
tapping
there.
in, right? So I can sometimes make some things louder and some things quieter.
Yeah, and that one time I did something where I was just
Right.
woo, it was crystal
Right.
clear.
Yeah. I mean, I get clients all the time that, they'll be visited by something and it's like, okay, I come at it with anything is possible
It is.
and I don't know everything and I don't want to know everything and I don't pretend to ever know everything. Right. So if that was your experience, that was your experience. Let's unpack it. Let's work it through. All often, like it sometimes drives them a little, they get in their head, like, did I imagine it?
Nah,
Did I
definitely
do
didn't imagine that.
something? But without them telling me what happened, and I'll connect to their Akashic records because they're asking me to explain or give them a little bit more context as to what happened there because they're a little bit unnerved. I'm picking up on exactly the same thing and describing the exact same thing that they experienced without them telling me. So if I'm picking it up and they experience it in a line, then who's to say, you know?
No. If two different people pick up on the same thing, and that's two different separate consciousness,
Yeah,
well, technically it's just one consciousness.
right.
That's what we're going with.
It's all one. We all have access to pulling it from one. It's a matter of like, same thing.
Source.
Source.
Yeah.
Source.
Or the
There's a
force. I
common
like saying the
energy of
force.
love, and everybody
Yeah.
speaks love differently, but it's still one energy.
Do you
and
think
it's
that's like
still
the highest form of vibration, love, or is truth?
I think there's probably something even bigger than love. I would say that like the energy of unconditional love is different than love.
Yeah. Yeah. Like love for a mother for the child.
Yeah, and then I think this loving something other than yourself in
Yeah.
general, insert here whatever that is for you.
Loving thy neighbor.
Yeah, I think it's different for everyone, and I think you feel it. Like I feel like people people are much more connected to energy than they think they are. I think people can has people have had an experience at one point in their life where they've walked into a room and they've experienced feeling something different about the room they walked into, whether that there was an argument right before and you don't know that that happened, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
tension in the air. We describe it as a tension in the air. You're walking into an energy of anger and
How
your
do you?
body's walking into it, but we describe it as a tension that you felt. Or you're in a meeting and you feel, what are you feeling? You're feeling an energy.
You are feeling under it.
But people dismiss that as something that's real, but we've all experienced it. We're just not thinking about it in that context, right? Like we're not applying those experiences to our everyday life. And so when I work with, I try to connect those dots and make them see everyday things that they dismiss as, no, this is what's happening. It's just I'm kind of making you think about it differently,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that you understand my world a little bit more, right?
Seeing your own self from a different perspective.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Making things much more relatable, right? Like you can only take in so much. I don't like to give people information, right? People have to process their own information, right? You retain and you retain things better when you can apply it that way.
Yeah, yeah,
It's our
yeah,
selfish nature,
yeah.
Play into that a little bit more, right? So it's like we all had an experience most likely where you've been someplace and it feels very familiar. Well, what is happening? I feel that it's a remembrance. It's a soul's remembrance of being there, right?
Deja vu.
So yeah, described as deja vu, and you don't know why you know what you know, and or same thing with people. You feel more inherently connected to some people and gravitate toward people, and our logical mind wants to go into its thinking and say, well, why? What is there? It's nothing other than energy and
But
connections
I've been
and
telling my logical mind just chill out, just let it happen. But it
yeah,
does. It helps.
it does. It
Like it just helps me
does.
get to where I want
Yeah.
quicker, and
Yeah.
like it's just easier.
Yeah.
And when people are like, "Life is hard. You're supposed to struggle and work hard," like, no, not really.
Not
Like I don't believe that
really.
shit anymore. Like my
No.
parents taught me that society, public school, but not
It can
anymore.
be that way if that's
No,
your
if you believe it,
mindset
yeah,
and your
yeah, yeah, yeah.
thinking, right?
But it
Because you
doesn't
have
have
to
to be that way.
something to prove,
Right.
right?
It doesn't have to be that way.
And there's always going to be judgment and there's always going to be criticism and there's always going to be this. And yeah, there are moments in life where they can be very, I like to say more uncomfortable than difficult. Difficult is a choice.
Yeah, yeah.
Things feel comfortable, things feel uncomfortable.
But yet uncomfortable, yet comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Right?
But then it's exactly how do you get comfortable with the
Just throwing
uncomfortable?
yourself in the situation of the unknown and just believing in yourself.
Don't think about it so much,
Or
right?
yeah, that too.
You're, our brains are kind of hardwired to protect us.
They are. Do you think the egos there protect you also?
Oh, absolutely. That's the whole mission of the ego is to
Really?
protect us. Yeah. I don't think it necessarily works against you. I think it wants it's a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
It's your instincts to want to survive, and unfortunately, it repeats a lot of the things that we already tell ourselves is necessary to survive, and so it kind of stays in those patterns, right?
Okay.
It's like this type of person is scary to me. And then that's forever what the ego is going to think about. And then it's hard to break through. And really, it's like, well, is it? And that's when you have to kind of challenge that, right? It's like, who who is it that's kind of dictating your world? Is it your ego and fear?
Is it the television?
Is it the television?
society?
Is it society? Again, insert here whatever applies to you in every situation, right? But at the end of the day, you're the one that you have to look at in the mirror. You're the one that have to be settled with the decisions you make in life, and that I think is all that matters.
Cool. One question. I mean, I don't promote psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
But when I had that experience when
Mm-hmm.
I was in my room just vibrating,
Sure.
I told my friends that are pretty much they do some heavy drugs.
Sure.
They're like, that was a complete LSD experience you had.
Correct.
Is there something about like psychedelics or like ayahuasca,
Yeah.
San Pedro that helps you vibrate at a higher frequency?
Yeah, it actually takes you outside of yourself. I'm for that for whoever finds that to be helpful. Where I pause and where I hesitate, it's almost like you're creating an environment you weren't prepared for. and then you're left with what you just
I,
experienced.
I see it as a crutch.
It's a crutch, and it also can be very traumatic,
It
right?
can.
Like
Yeah, yeah.
you're suddenly thrown into an existence that you didn't know existed, and then you're left, like, you come off of it, and then now you're forced to face life, and but how do you reconcile
Or
what
how
you
do you get
just
back?
experienced,
How do
right?
you get back?
Or how do you get back? And so I just tread, when people go into that, it's like find places that can support a transition, right? Because there's a transition period. You
Mm-hmm.
just went from one state to another state very fast, 0 to 60. And now what, right? You're just left with that experience. So I have a lot of people that do that constantly then seek to reproduce that in the same caliber. Well, you can do that, but it's not as fast and it's not as easy.
Yeah,
There's
I
more
mean,
work. It's the same thing. People like to take shortcuts in life.
big time.
That could be a shortcut that, that some people feel that they need. And sometimes it's an accelerant. Some people, that's what they needed to jumpstart, and then they maintain, right? But my hesitation is just, if you're doing that, be mindful that there's some integration that needs to happen in what you just happened to you and then life. It's like any traumatic event, you've
That's
got
super
to
traumatic.
be able to, yeah, it could be a positive traumatic event for
Yeah,
you if
it
that's
can.
what, but it's still a traumatic event, right? Like your body's physically doing different things, your levels of cortisone spike, like your nervous system is triggered, just like any traumatic expense like would do. So it's the same process. It's just, your interpretation of what your experience is, because I've had people who've had very positive experiences and some people who have had very negative experiences, right? Either way, there needs to be some process of integration
So
and
just be
to
careful.
processing the information. Like, as if you had a traumatic event, you'd go to therapy to process what just happened to you. You probably need the same if you're doing any of these things. Like, you need to process, what did I just experience? What does this mean? What was my life before? What is my life after? What do do the beliefs I have before still carry? Like, there's so many things that you have to process, that I think that's where these things become dangerous, right?
Okay.
A dependency or not a proper integration and transition.
Okay. Got it. I've seen it go both ways.
Yeah.
I've literally seen it go both ways.
Both ways.
Yeah. Some people were prepared. Some people just really needed it.
Mm-hmm.
Some people just were not ready for that such a thing. And there's something else that I really like studied. It's called the dark night of the soul.
Okay.
The people that were not ready for it,
Mm-hmm.
they go through this whole upside down shift.
Yeah.
And then they start telling their friends and family. Their friends will probably think they're kooky.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, "What are you talking about, dude? You're a devoted Catholic."
Sure.
And suddenly all this happens. And then how do you explain that? They're like, but for them it was as real as me and you just sitting here.
Of course.
And it probably was real for them.
Probably was.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
reality is a lot of it is perception.
Yeah,
right?
perception is
it's
reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Good. I highly recommend people come see you for like a
Thank you.
Reiki session, or maybe if they just need help with certain things.
Yeah.
Metaphysical. I'll
Yeah.
put your information on
Great.
so they can reach out to you.
Sounds good.
One last question I always like to ask people as I end. If people are down on their luck, maybe they're depressed or sad, what advice would you have for them?
I think, honestly, just start bare bones, like, take care of yourself. Really identify what needs you have, and that can be very different for many different people. So I think it first starts with some level of introspection and be like, what do I need in this moment in my life? And then act very selfishly to give that to yourself
Yeah.
and make yourself okay. Because if you can't be okay, you can't take on other things,
Yeah.
right? It all starts small. And you'd be surprised how much the little things add up too.
Compound. The compounds.
Compound, exactly. But we need that payoff. As humans, we're all really conditioned to reward,
Yeah. And I would say
so
help yourself before you help other people.
help yourself before you help others. You really can't be of service to others
If you're sick and dying.
if you're sick and dying. Energetically, you just can't hold it. You can't support, we float in water. If water wasn't capable of supporting us, we'd all
Yeah.
sink, right? So there has to be some level of vibration, some substance there that then allows us and gives us the strength to be able then to be of service of others.
Got it. So take care of yourself first.
Yeah, and also I want to say you don't have to be perfect, right? We're never perfect. We're
Nobody's
always
perfect.
in a work of progress. So I think that it's also be realistic. Like there's a learning that can happen in the collective, just as in service of others. There's a lot that you can learn yourself and expand and grow yourself, and that's the whole point of life is to grow, expand, and develop and question. And you can see that as a beautiful freedom, or
Yeah.
you can see it as the opposite. People
Yeah.
run scared. What do you
No,
mean?
no. I love what you said. You put a smile on my face when you said just grow and question. That's how
Grow
you
and
learn. I mean, you've been
question.
taught not to question things, not to question your elders, but that's when you actually do learn and grow.
There's nothing wrong with that. What do we lose? I think as long as it's done from a place of love, compassion, and respect,
Yeah.
and not never in service of trying to
Just be right.
invalidate somebody else's experience as well,
Yeah.
right? We don't walk other people's shoes. We don't know what they've been with. And again, perception is reality. So if it's real for them, it's real for them. We can hold both to be true.
And just be respectful for others. Got it? Cool. That's a great way to end the podcast. Right on.
Great.
Yeah. I'll leave your information, ladies and gentlemen. Since you like this episode, go and subscribe, and we'll catch you
Perfect.
next time. Thanks for jumping on.
You're welcome.
Yeah, appreciate it.